Hi folks, this is Calc 2 Take-Home Assignment 2. We're asked to find the third derivative of this rather complicated looking thing. So I'm going to call this function y, and I'm just going to take one derivative at a time. Now, really what's happening here is I have a product rule. I have one function of x times another function of x. And so for y prime, the product rule says I take the derivative of the first factor, and the derivative of the first factor would be 11(7) e to the minus x over 2 times the derivative of this exponent, which is negative 1/2. And then I multiply that by the second factor. Plus, I take the first factor and multiply it by the derivative of the second factor. The derivative of the second factor is going to be negative sine of x radical 3 over 2 times, chain rule, the derivative of the inside, which gives me a radical 3 over 2. And the hint I gave in class was to factor out the exponential part actually as much as you can as you go from step to step. So what can I factor out here? Certainly the 11(7), the e to the negative x over 2, and also the negative 1/2. So I'll go ahead and factor all that out. And we'll see what I'm left with. I'm left with cosine x radical 3 over 2 plus radical 3 sine x radical 3 over 2. And that'll give us the first derivative. Okay, so here's our y prime. Now we need to get our y double prime, our second derivative. And once again, we're going to have to use the product rule. Here's the first function of x. Here's the second function of x. So we take the derivative of the first function. I get negative 11(7) over 2, e to the minus x over 2. And from that chain rule again, I get negative 1/2. Then I multiply it by the second function, as is. And I need to add that now. I take the first function as is times the derivative of the second function. So the derivative of cosine of something is sine of that thing. Excuse me, negative sine of that thing. And then chain rule says I multiply by the derivative of the inside. Plus radical 3, I take the derivative of sine of something, that's cosine of that thing. And chain rule says I multiply by the derivative of the inside. And so now what we try to do is make sense of this and simplify it. So what can we factor out of both? Well, certainly the negative 11(7) over 2 e to the minus x over 2 can come out. And now I have to play around with what's going to be left over. I'm going to have a negative 1/2 cosine x radical 3 over 2. What am I going to get over here? I'm going to get a 3/2 cosine. So negative 1/2 cosine plus 3/2 cosine gives me 1 cosine. When I multiply the negative 1/2 through here, I get negative square root 3 over 2 sine. Here's negative square root 3 over 2 sine. So that's negative 2 square root 3 over 2, or negative square root 3 sine x radical 3 over 2. And so that's my simplified second derivative. Okay, so here's our second derivative again. Y double prime equals negative 11(7) over 2 e to the minus x over 2 times cosine x radical 3 over 2 minus radical 3 sine x radical 3 over 2. And now it's time for the third derivative. And once again, we're going to have to use our friend the product rule and the chain rule. So the derivative of the first factor is negative 11(7) over 2 e to the minus x over 2 times negative 1/2 times the second one. We leave it as is. Plus dot 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 plus. We leave the first one as is. Whoops, I don't know what happened there. Plus negative 1187 over 2 e to the minus x over 2 times the derivative of the second factor. So the derivative of cosine of something is minus sine of that thing times the derivative of the inside minus radical 3. The derivative of sine of something is cosine of that thing times the derivative of the inside. And let's see what happens when we simplify this. You know something remarkable has to happen, because I wouldn't have put you through all this torture for nothing. So let's see. I can factor out a negative 1187 over 2 e to the minus x over 2. I'm going to have a negative 1/2 cosine, and I'm going to have a negative 3/2 cosine. So negative 1/2 minus 3/2 is negative 4/2, so that's a negative 2 cosine. I'm going to have a positive square root 3 over 2 sine, and I have a negative square root 3 over 2 sine, so they drop out. And miracle of miracles, look what happens. I have a negative 2, I have a negative 2, I get 1187 e to the minus x over 2 cosine x radical 3 over 2. And what's so special about this? This is the guy we started with, folks. So here's an example of a derivative who comes back to himself in the third derivative. We know that sine and cosine come back to themselves after 4 derivatives. We know e to the x comes back to itself immediately, and we know e to the minus x along with sinh and cosh come back to themselves after 2 iterations. This comes back to itself after 3. And so all that work was worth it to see that cool thing happen. Well, maybe it wasn't worth it for that cool thing, but it certainly was worth 5 points. And that'll do it for Take Home 2.